Imagine the amount of microplastics in your brain weighing as much as a plastic spoon. In a recent study published in Research Square, researchers aimed to find out the amount of micro and nanoplastics embedded within the human body. As always, I want to make very clear that nothing that you find in this channel can be considered medical advice in any way, shape or form. So with that said, let's begin with this amazing and very interesting study. Researchers have uncovered alarming numbers of microplastics embedded mostly within the human brain. This discovery raises pressing questions about the health implications this could have. The research team, led by Dr. Matthew Campen in the New Mexico University, analyzed post-mortem tissue samples from the kidneys, the liver, the brain, and specifically the frontal cortex of the brain. The samples were collected in 2016 and 2024, which is very good for the credibility of the study because we can see the number of microplastics in the human tissue within almost a decade period of time. Utilizing advanced techniques of measuring microplastics in human tissue, like pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry, they were able to quantify the number of nanoplastics and microplastics. So what were the key findings of the study? I would say that the most important one was that the highest concentrations appeared to be in the brain. The brain samples exhibited 30 times higher plastic concentrations than the samples from the liver or the kidneys. In 2024, the average concentration in brain tissue was 4,806, and that's microgram per gram. This equates to 0.5% of the tissue's weight. Some samples contained even 8,681, and that's again micrograms per gram. Since the study utilized samples from both 2016 and 2024, obviously we have to talk about the temporal increase between the two time periods. Brain tissue in particular exhibited over a 50% higher concentration of microplastics within this 8-year period, which as a percentage mirrors and is able to reflect the production of plastics in the world and the environmental pollution this causes. We produce more plastics, so it is reasonable to assume more plastics will lead to our tissues from food, from drinks, from swimming, from anything. We're gonna talk about all the ways in which microplastics can actually end up in our body later in the video. In these diagrams, you can see the difference in microplastic concentrations within this 8-year period for each type of tissue they took a sample from separately. One thing is also very important to note, and this is the predominance of polyethylene. Polyethylene is commonly used in packaging materials like plastic bottles or plastic bags, and it was the most prevalent polymer of microplastics detected in all these samples. One thing we also ought to mention is the nanoscopic particle size of these plastics. In the study, they used transmission electron microscopy with this machine. This revealed that many of the detected plastics were actually in a nanoscale, often less than 200 nanometers in length. These fragments are small enough to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier, going from our arteries and blood vessels to our brain, because of their such a small size. Now let's try to explain one reason for which the concentration of microplastics in the brain could be so much higher than all the other tissue samples collected. The liver and the kidney, for example, which showed smaller concentrations of microplastics, could be because they are the frontline warrior organs of the body. I call them warrior organs because they are responsible for xenobiotic clearance. This means anything that doesn't belong to the body, they clear it up. With that said though, the lipophilic nature of plastic particles could mean that they could mix and form bonds with other lipids. If plastic particles are able to bind to the lipid particles, then that would mean that the liver, for example, could process them and excrete them from the body much more easily, since the liver is what already deals with triglycerides and cholesterol, which are both lipid structures. Once again, our liver is here to protect us. So what could be the possible implications and concerns of these extremely high plastic concentrations in our own human brain and body? Well, it is very concerning since we need the brain for very important functions and we need to keep it in place and safe. But this study demonstrated that microplastics actually do have the ability to travel through the blood-brain barrier, meaning going into our brain from the blood vessels surrounding it. This suggests potential pathways that could occur for neurotoxic effects. At this point, let's make clear that the effects in the health from nanoparticles and microplastics remain unclear. We don't have so much research that clearly shows what exactly plastics do once they enter the human body. But several hypotheses have been suggested by top-level researchers all around the world, and these are the following. Neurological impacts. Microplastics may interfere with neuronal communications and also trigger inflammatory responses leading to inflammatory neurodegenerative conditions like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, but we will also mention something additional for that a bit later on. Inflammation and cellular damage is the second hypothesis. The physical presence of these nano and microparticles could initiate an inflammatory response, and oxidative stress as well. Another hypothesis is chemical leaching. Plastics often also contain additives, mostly bisphenol and phthalates. These are known for their estrogen-mimicking properties, meaning that they mimic estrogen in the human body. And we know that when estrogen exists in very high concentrations, it can be pretty much considered a stress hormone. Once these nanoparticles and microplastics leach out in the human body, they could promote hormonal imbalances. But the researchers very well state in their study, and let me quote from the study. The extent to which microplastics cause harm or toxicity is unclear, although recent studies associated microplastic presence in carotid arteriomas with increased inflammation and risk of future adverse cardiovascular events. In controlled exposure studies, microplastics clearly enhance or drive toxic outcomes. The mantra of the field of toxicology, dose makes the poison. And by that they mean how many microplastics do we actually need to have in order to develop a health condition. What is not clearly understood is the internal dose in humans. However, the researchers didn't dive into the health implications the microplastics could have. They only measured the concentrations that existed in the body, not the effects these high concentrations will have. And they noted that this topic is better suited for an entirely new study to conclude. Now that we have established all the findings of this incredible, very interesting study, a good question to ask would be, where are all these microplastics coming from? Microplastics are tiny plastic particles less than 5 millimeters in size. One primary source is the degradation of other bigger plastic products, like bottles, plastic bags, etc. Through exposure to sunlight and physical abrasion, these begin to disintegrate with time, and when they get destroyed, these microplastics leach out in all the other things we consume. Additionally, some microplastics are also intentionally manufactured, like microbeads, which existed in cosmetic products, but now they are mostly banned in most countries. These plastics are present in oceans, rivers, or drinking water, and they also pose a threat to marine life. They are also found in soil, where they can affect plant growth, and they can also enter the foods we eat, the vegetables, the fruits, anything underground. Microplastics also exist in the air we breathe, as demonstrated by this study, and they also stick to our lungs once we inhale them. Their contamination has been so widespread, it is almost impossible to completely get rid of them or not get them in our body in the first place. As it is demonstrated by this paper, microplastics in the soil are absorbed by plants. But also, let's say that you eat seafood or fish. If these marine animals ingested microplastics in the ocean and then you eat them, then you also consume the microplastics they consumed beforehand. But beyond food and water, you will also encounter microplastics in many of the things you use perhaps daily. More of that at the end of the video, where we will demonstrate what you can do to limit your exposure to microplastics as much as possible. So let's analyze the final concerns. One of the most concerning aspects, in my opinion, the most concerning, is how easy it is for microplastics, especially nanoplastics, to enter the blood-brain barrier and leach out in the brain. Think of the blood-brain barrier as a protective shield, which protects the brain and doesn't allow anything to pass in the brain which is not supposed to be there. Yet this study demonstrated that nanoplastics smaller than 100 nanometers can pass in our brain within just 2 hours after inhalation. The next concern is that when these microplastics are again leached out in the brain or any human tissue for that matter, they can stay there, and it is very difficult to get them out because we have no known way to get out microplastics from the body. It is a very new concept in healthcare. There is an animal study from the Journal of Hazardous Materials which found that nanoplastics contribute to neurotoxicity. The hypothesized mechanism, which they found in the animal models, is that they accelerated the production of beta-amyloid peptides, which is the main pathogenic protein for many of these neurodegenerative diseases. Also, a 2023 study, very recent study, published in the Yonsei Medical Journal, provides a comprehensive overview of how these microplastics actually affect the human body from the things we already know. So finally, what are the actions we can take to protect ourselves? As we conclude our discussion on microplastics and their potential health impacts, it's essential to focus on the practical steps we can take to minimize the exposure we get to these microplastics. I would say it is completely impossible to fully eliminate them from our life. As we previously said and demonstrated, they are literally everywhere. Firstly, I would avoid to heat food in plastic containers or in the microwave. Heating plastic leads to its breakdown and a lot of microplastics are released from that. Use glass or ceramic containers. Do not drink water from plastic bottles, and even paper bottles, whether it's water or your morning Starbucks, actually have a plastic layer on top on the inside part. So it's not actually paper, because what you're drinking from comes from a microplastic layering. Use non-plastic kitchenware. This means wooden spoons and ceramic or cast iron pans. Most importantly, your plastic cutting board. When you cut from a plastic cutting board, you are literally cutting through the plastic. What did you expect to get? Obviously, you will get a lot of these plastic particles in your food. And lastly, opt for natural fibers when it comes to clothes. Avoid polyester clothing and any plastic fiber for that matter. Wear natural fibers like cotton, like wool, like silk. Regularly clean your home, and that can be vacuuming, sure, but also the air quality is very important too. Get a very good air filter. Be very mindful about cosmetic products as well, and that primarily goes to women and partly in makeup and lipstick. All these things, if they're not very well tested from third-party labs, are very likely to contain a lot of microplastics. And lastly, filter your tap water with a reverse osmosis filter. This has been proven to be the best type of filter to filter out any microplastics or even chloride or fluoride that can exist in your water. It also clears it out almost completely. By now, it is safe to say that this study is pretty groundbreaking. It changed completely our view concerning how many of these microplastics are we actually ingesting within our food, lifestyle, etc. And it appears to be a lot of microplastics. Although there are some things we can do about them, like the things we just mentioned, it is very interesting to see where this type of research goes. If you enjoy science-based insights to health and wellness, then perhaps you should consider subscribing. Stay happy and healthy until the next one.